can get behind. If, on the other hand, the new administration seeks to chart a new course for American foreign policy, it will have to find avenues of consensus among an increasingly fractured public.
The supercontinent of Eurasia is home to 60% of the global economy and 2/3 of humanity. It's been called the geographic pivot of history. For over 4 centuries, Eurasia's economic focus has been the maritime passages that surround it. But during ancient times, many of the world's most important trading routes ran overland. Today, regional powers are putting forward competing visions for reconnecting Asia. Roads, railways, and other infrastructure projects could revive overland routes. They could forge new maritime connections, and they could reshape the global economic landscape. The stakes are high. Last century's infrastructure projects fueled development, but also competition, and even conflict. Today's efforts could echo well beyond the region.
And the basic reality is that the division of the world into kind of totally separate, autonomous entities and other areas controlled by sometimes foreigners is coming to an end.
What's driving these projects? Will they connect in an economically meaningful way?
What does that foretell? What does that mean in terms of political ambitions and how people will look at the region differently, and will they behave in a different way?
The Reconnecting Asia project provides new tools for answering these questions, beginning with what's really happening on the ground. Use this interactive website to track the evolution of Asia's infrastructure network at the project level. Explore the who, what, and why behind these megaprojects. See tomorrow's supercontinent through the eyes of regional powers. Make sense of it all with expert analysis that uncovers the trend lines behind today's headlines. This is reconnectingasia.csis.org.
China is rising. Its economy is now the second largest in the world. China is the world's largest trader, having surpassed the United States, and Chinese military capabilities are expanding. In just a few decades, China has moved from the periphery to the center of the international system. But what does that really mean for the world? In some ways, China is a developed country, yet in other ways, it is still developing. China's transformation is often misunderstood, and the future of Chinese power is uncertain. Power itself is a nebulous concept. Power can be relative. It can be absolute. It can be perceived and anticipated. So how can we decipher power? Through China Power, CSIS unpacks the complexity of China's rise by analysing the key components of Chinese power. What are China's strengths? What are its weaknesses? Does China's rise present a threat or an opportunity? Or both? What questions are you asking? Join the conversation at chinapower.csis.org.
The war in Syria represents a new low for the international community. We're seeing a war without law, as well as seemingly a war without end. It's very, very striking that we're living in an age of the bombing of UN convoys, never mind the targeting of hospitals.
So we were so surprised and shocked when we saw our colleagues covered with their blood and giving their last breaths. I don't know how to describe that. It's so hard emotionally. It's like you are losing one of your precious in front of your eyes.
We're witnessing a profound surge of violence against civilians, against health workers, patients, facilities, humanitarian convoys across a full spectrum of countries that is really shredding the accountability and protections that are contained in the Geneva Conventions.
The attack on Kunduz was a sustained attack over an hour, despite the fact that all the parties knew us, had our GPS coordinate. We must say that it was our biggest loss in terms of lives. 42 people died, 14 of our staff.
This was a tragic mistake.
This is a period when there and a danger for by states that are strong enough to do so. The international sense of conscience and consciousness that led to the responsibility to protect in the early 2000s has certainly been eroded.
People are struggling to respond. They're building clinics and hospitals in underground bunkers. They're documenting these attacks and publishing them. They're taking measures to the UN Security Council.
Stop bombing hospital. Stop bombing health workers.
But up to now, these measures have not had much effect in deterring attacks. But many courageous individuals and groups continue the fight. This is a fight that's going to last well into the future.
We believe that war stopped at the door of our hospital, and we want to preserve that. And we want to preserve access to healthcare in war zones. That's a battle that's worth to fight.
I have huge confidence in other people and a degree of confidence in myself that has sometimes helped me take those crazy risks that I took.
And what accounts for that degree of confidence in yourself?
Love.
Love?
Yeah. Yeah. You have, I mean, I'm sorry, this is outside the economic field by a long way. But yeah, I very strongly believe that you can, love generates confidence. If your parents love you, if your siblings love you, if your spouse, companion, whoever, or your children love you, it gives you that level of confidence that helps you move to the next step or do something else which is harder, bigger, or further. Yeah.
That's very, very smart and very powerful. Wow.
While much of the world focuses on terrorism in the Middle East, violent extremist groups have expanded their ambitions and reach in Africa as well. In the Western Sahel, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has produced or inspired a proliferation of extremist groups that continue to destabilize the region. In the areas around Lake Chad, Boko Haram, with its origins in northeast Nigeria, has left tens of thousands of civilians dead and displaced almost 3 million people. The security vacuum in Libya and the presence of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda deepen the risks to the Sahel region.
There has been a lot of turmoil and trouble with these radical elements, which you find in this arc of instability from North Africa to Afghanistan.
Military intervention by regional forces, France, and the UN have weakened these groups and reclaimed territories they once held. But the drivers of militancy and the complex social, economic, and political environment that fuels these groups remain very much intact. Unless this understructure of vulnerability and criminality is addressed, extremist violence will remain an enduring threat to the region.
Air power and military space systems have revolutionized the way the U.S. military operates, and the global economy increasingly depends on reliable and secure access to space systems. The Aerospace Security project at CSIS examines the technological, budgetary, and policy issues affecting the air and space domains. Our research is focused in 3 areas. Space security examines the evolving military uses of space and how the lack of norms of behavior can affect escalation and deterrence. It explores how alternative architectures and new space capabilities can enhance the resilience of U.S. military space systems. Air Dominance and Long-Range Strike looks at the future of air and missile forces in a more contested operating environment. It examines the role of stealth, unmanned systems, and autonomous systems, how these capabilities can be integrated to enable new operational concepts, and options for the air and ground-based legs of the nuclear triad. Commercial and Civil Space explores international partnerships in space, efforts to reduce the cost of launch, advances in commercial space technologies, and policy issues that affect civil and commercial space programs. The goal of the Aerospace Security project is to provide innovative, insightful, and timely analysis to help educate and inform decision makers. As new opportunities, threats, and technologies emerge, smart policy decisions can ensure the United States continues to lead in the air and space domains. Welcome to the Aerospace Security Project.
The divided Korean Peninsula remains one of the largest sources of uncertainty and potential conflict in a prosperous and growing Asia. Unification of Korea will be one of the biggest changes to the geopolitical landscape and is seen by the world as a dark tunnel. Opacity among regional powers creates confusion. Misunderstanding impedes smart planning. False assumptions could cause costly strategic blunders. But CSIS believes the potential for growth, prosperity, and peace of a united Korea is immense. How can we maximize the social, humanitarian, and economic returns of a unified Korea while avoiding conflict? Beyond Parallel is an unprecedented and comprehensive resource for bringing transparency to the many challenges and opportunities of Korean unification. Beyond Parallel investigates the broader implications of unification, but also the specific issues that Korea and the world face. These critical issues are explored through expert analysis, satellite imagery, and cutting-edge methods of data collection. Welcome to Beyond Parallel.
Hit-to-kill ballistic missile defense is the ultimate precision guidance challenge. Many elements of a defense must come together to achieve a long-range intercept. One of the most important and difficult parts is known as mid-course discrimination. After a ballistic missile launches, its engines burn hot and can be detected by infrared satellites. Outside the Earth's atmosphere, the missile engines burn out and it reaches its peak velocity. At this point, the missile's payload, a warhead, usually separates from the rest of the body. The warhead is also accompanied by the flying junk pile of debris created by launching a missile, as well as by decoys or other countermeasures designed to complicate the missile defense job. All of these objects move together through space as part of a threat cloud. So for a missile defense system to successfully destroy the warhead, its various sensors must first discriminate it from among the various other parts of the cloud. The key to successful discrimination is the sensor architecture. Sea and land-based radars provide one picture of the threat cloud. Lower frequency radars are able to track the threat cloud, but have trouble distinguishing within it. Once cued, higher frequency or X-band radars provide much sharper images of the objects within the cloud. But radars are limited by their vantage point and by their technology. Multiple phenomenologies can provide a more complete rendering and classification. Air or space-based sensors provide still other perspectives with greater persistence, potentially allowing for birth-to-death tracking. And infrared sensors show not just objects but their heat signature, especially low-orbit satellites looking sideways, comparing the objects against the coldness of space. Currently, U.S. homeland missile defense is dependent upon only terrestrial radars. This places a large burden on the sensor network and makes it harder to identify the objects. That in turn means that the defender has to engage more of the objects in the cloud so as not to miss the warhead, either by firing more interceptors or multiple kill vehicles atop a single one. After the interceptors are launched, they receive imagery of the threat cloud, which algorithms compare to a threat database to help pick which objects should be engaged. All this is fused with the kill vehicle's own observations using onboard sensors to make the final determination for intercept. Finally, they maneuver into position to collide with the several targets that could be a warhead. The discrimination challenge is hard, but not insurmountable. An efficient and robust discrimination system should include a mix of sensors with different technologies from different domains on land, sea, air, and space.
Currently, India ranks 54th on the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index, more than 20 spots below manufacturing competitors like China and Malaysia. This is a major challenge for Modi's Make in India initiative. For example, India's truckers report that 15% to 25% of travel time is actually spent waiting at the heavily enforced state border checkpoints. They pay as much as $1.1 billion a year in bribes to state officials. The main problem is that India does not have a single national market. Its 29 states and 7 union territories each have their own system of sales taxes. As a result, internal borders look more like international ones. The version of the goods and services tax sitting before Parliament isn't perfect, but it will cut down on transit time for goods, paperwork for businesses, and could add 0.5% to annual economic growth. A seamless national tax environment will help Indian commerce flow more quickly.
I believe in strong alliances, clarity in dealing with our rivals.
What is the very last
and I take the oil.
Populism, border walls, retrenchment, and protectionism. While foreign policy is often overshadowed by economic concerns, contrasting visions of America's role in the world have played a major part in the recent election cycle. This contentious campaign season saw some of the basic tenets of U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II called into question. Does this heightened acrimony over key aspects of U.S. international engagement reflect trends toward isolationism? It may seem unprecedented, but it is in fact not new. Today's controversies are continuations of debates that have lasted for decades. While support for the nation playing an active part in global affairs has remained strong since 1947, public opinion on key components of U.S. international engagement, such as defense spending, has waxed and waned over the last 70 years in response to economic trends, military interventions, and domestic priorities. In the first decades of the Cold War, America was committed to international engagement as a part of its strategy of containment against the existential threat presented by the Soviet Union. The U.S. experience in Vietnam, however, created an aversion to overseas military engagements that lasted from the late 1960s through the 70s. During the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union led the U.S. public and policymakers to again question defense spending levels, foreign aid, and forward military presence. Many thought the limited interventions of Desert Storm in Kosovo would serve as models for future military operations. Then came September 11, 2001. Our response to the events of that day have largely defined contemporary American foreign policy since. First came the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Their unsatisfactory outcomes left much of the public and policymaking elites disillusioned with large-scale military engagements. The result of that disillusionment has been an increasing reliance on small footprint forces for a variety of contingency operations, including in the global war on terror. At home, the most severe recession since the Great Depression exacerbated America's growing reservations about global engagement. As the economy recovered at an anemic pace, income inequality ballooned. Fewer were able to reap the benefits of our globalized economy. Opposition to free trade and large-scale immigration grew. Now, 8 years after the recession and the more than 15 after 9/11, views on the desirability of America's international engagement strategy are fractured. For the first time ever in 2009, and again in 2013, most Americans responded that the U.S. should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along the best they can on their own. This comes at the same time that more people are concerned about major domestic terror attacks than in 2002, just months after 9/11. Do these polls reflect temporary reactions to the state of public affairs? Or is there a genuine trend toward retrenchment in the American public? Democrats and Republicans now disagree on the benefits of free trade, alliances, and multilateral approaches. Divergences in threat perceptions and approaches to international engagement have also grown between the American public and policymakers. As history shows, this is not a new debate in American politics.
I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here at CSIS, and I want to thank you for joining us early on this Thursday morning to have a conversation about U.S. strategy toward Russia. There are two parts to the conversation this morning. First, the conversation with Senator Johnson, and then we will have a panel discussion to roll out the report that CSIS is releasing today on this topic. Let me just, before we begin anything, start with a safety reminder. We have safety precautions we always give in this building. We feel very safe, but should you hear a fire alarm, please follow my directions. There's exits toward Rhode Island Avenue that you all came in, and we also have exits in the back of the building. And again, I will direct you accordingly. So, first of all, I want to say thank you to Senator Johnson for joining us this morning. He has a hard stop because of a vote, so we're going to go to 9:30 and then stop. Senator Ron Johnson is from Wisconsin, Republican. He's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security Cooperation. He is the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. And he's certainly an important voice within the Senate and within the Republican Party on security issues. We're very grateful to have him here with us today. Senator, what I thought we would do is just start with some opening remarks from you on this topic of Russia and U.S. security, and then we have a little bit of a conversation.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm a little ill at ease because you folks are experts at this. My background, I'm an accountant by education, ran a plastics manufacturing company for 30-some years, was, by the way, part of a British company, so we export a product all over the world. So I have traveled over the world, but I've only been in the Senate now 6 years and 2 months and 4 days, but who's counting? So, what I would like to do is give kind of a general overall perspective of somebody who is relatively new on the scene. By no means an expert, as many of you here in the audience are. But let me start. One of the things I just got my copy of this report that's going to be rolled out here today. Immediately like it because it has numbers and charts and graphs in it, which relate to me. And let me start with some, I think, pretty relevant facts that we need to be very mindful of. U.S. defense spending. In the 60s, on average, this is the Vietnam War period, we spent over 8% of GDP on defense. In the 70s and 80s, we averaged over 5%, but as is unfortunately almost a custom in America is we'll have some administrations hollow out our military and the next administration's got to build it up. So Jimmy Carter let our defense go down to about 4.5%. Ronald Reagan boosted it back up to 6%. And then, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed, and we were just talking about this, Kathleen or Doctor, and I were talking about the people writing about the end of history. We'd finally achieved world peace, end of the Cold War, and so over the 90s, we really hollowed out our military, and the low point was 2.9% is what America spent on defense. Now, then 9/11 happened, and we boosted that back up on average over 4%, but currently right now we're only spending 3.2%. And prodding our NATO partners to at least achieve the 2%. So I think it's important to kind of keep that little factoid in perspective. From my standpoint, the defense of this nation is the top priority of government. And when we continue to slack off, when we continue to reduce what we spend, when we continue to hollow out our military capability, that sends some pretty bad signals. And peace through strength is not just a slogan. It's actually how you achieve peace. And I think what we've seen certainly over the last 8 years, is a strategy of peace through withdrawal has been a miserable failure, which is where I'd kind of like to move my next remarks. My first CODEL as a senator was to Afghanistan and Pakistan. My second one, I think, around the Easter time period of 2011 was to what I would refer to as the ring of democracies around the Soviet Union, or around Russia. We started out in Georgia, when Saakashvili, I think, was pretty much the height of his power, and there's an awful lot of optimism. They'd stopped the advances. I was near Tbilisi. I looked across the border there. I was looking at binoculars, and I had Russian troops looking back at binoculars as well. But still, there was a real hope in Georgia that free market capitalism would kind of revive that economy, and we could keep Russia at bay. It was a problem, but we could keep them at bay. Went on to Ukraine. They were still at whole. They hadn't been invaded. The big problem there was corruption, continued to be corrupt, and finally sparked the Maidan. That was certainly one of the causes of that, and went also into the Baltic states. This is in, again, March, April of 2011. The result of that trip was the exact same result today in terms of the pervasiveness of Russian aggression, Russian disinformation, Russian destabilizing efforts. It hasn't stopped. It hasn't let up. It's become more and more persistent. So if you take a look at, again, the position we were in 2011, where things were a whole lot more stable, and Russia was still being aggressive, 6 years later, our weakness, our lack of resolve, Russia has gained so much more influence on the cheap. Here's another little factoid. You combine the GDP of America and the EU, it's somewhere around $34 trillion. GDP of Russia is somewhere south of $2 trillion. And I would argue what power is on the rise, what power has been on the wane, what power is back on our heels. So just take a look at economic might and strength. I mean, there should be no contest here, and yet there is, which I think points to the proximate cause of the reason things are in such turmoil is because the West has not exhibited and utilized the strength, the economic strength we have. And that'll be my final point. Strength begins with economic strength. Whether we're talking about how China perceives us, how Iran perceives us, how Russia perceives us, how North Korea perceives us. If they just take a look at our financial situation, America's $20 trillion in debt, over $60,000 per person. We have, over the next 30 years, a projected deficit of about $103 trillion. If you think we had bad economic times when the housing bubble burst, just wait to what happens when the debt crisis, the debt bubble bursts. So people realize this. These are facts. This is the truth. We are economically unstable because of our fiscal mismanagement. And of course, Europe is in no better shape, although interesting little fact is that the per capita debt of Greece is about half of what our per capita debt is, because we're the world's reserve currency. So from my standpoint, the number one thing we need to do as America in leading this effort of peace through strength, we have to strengthen our economy. We have to grow our economy. And this has nothing really to do with foreign policy other than the fact it has everything to do with foreign policy. But we need to reduce the regulatory burden. We have to have a globally competitive tax system. We need to use our energy resources. I'd love to be proposing seriously tort reform, but there are way too many lawyers in town. I'm an accountant. But we've got to get our financial and economic house in order. We have to make sure the American economy can realize its full potential so that we can actually exhibit the leadership and strength that the world is really craving for. I really don't believe America can be the world's policeman, but where it is in our national interest, in so many cases around the world, it is in our national interest, and we have the capability of stabilizing the situation. We need to get into those situations and provide the stability that only America can provide the leadership to do. So again, we have enormous tasks. I mean, I applaud CSIS for this report. The executive summary I read over the night, and just what I'm looking through here, this provides a really good basic set of facts and proposals that we can really move forward with. So I really applaud you for your effort.
Great, thank you, Senator Johnson. I really appreciate that you started with strengths, which is actually where our report starts as well. For many of the challenges that we've seen in the West, particularly as they have unfolded in the last year, Brexit, concern about immigration flows, concern about terrorism, attacks on civil society, issues of that sort, a breaking down of consensus within our politics. Many of these things we believe Russia has exploited, but it didn't invent. So you mentioned the economy as one major pillar for us to strengthen, maybe the major pillar. What are some of the other things that you've seen in your role in the Senate as areas where the United States and or Europe with the United States need to strengthen either institutionally or at first principles their societies in order to counter threats from countries like Russia?
I was in Brussels with John McCain over the weekend, and one of the little polls they had for the audience was, what is the greatest threat to peace and security? And they had Putin, and they had Islamist terrorism, then they had immigration, then they had Trump. Putin and Trump pretty well tied for the number one. But from my standpoint, it is Russia, it is the aggression of China, it's the aggression of Iran, it's the aggression of North Korea, and it's Islamist terror. And what to me threatens Europe right now is the out-of-control nature of what's happening in Syria and that migrant flow. America's a nation of immigrants, but it has to be illegal, it has to be a controlled process, and what transpired in Europe was not controlled. And it has a real possibility to stabilizing the countries within Europe, and that's not a good thing. So rather than often the discussion, liberals and progressives in particular will talk about, well, we have to treat people with humanity, we have to open up our doors, we have to, these are refugees, they're seeking asylum, we have to do everything we can, we have wealth, they don't, we have to give them opportunities. That's not the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem is the fact that those nations are destabilized. You have, 4 million refugees displaced outside of Syria, something like 7 to 9 million displaced inside. I mean, the root cause is the instability, the genocide that's occurring in Syria. What the rest ought to do is try and stabilize that situation. Long ago we should have established no-fly zones. We should have provided safe zones for those refugees inside Syria and supported that and then stabilized the situation. We didn't do that, and so now this is growing out of control. So you have to address the root cause of the problem, not address and try and heal the symptoms, because otherwise you're just going to be chasing one symptom after another.
So Russia, as I think as you said, you view as a threat, and clearly, as people will see as we roll out this report, we see as a threat. It has acted with aggression, particularly in the most recent years under Putin from 2008 forward. What do you think are the most compelling aspects of the U.S. toolkit that we should be strengthening? You spoke already specifically about defense. Are there other areas that you think the U.S. can contribute to deterring Russia or rolling back aggression from Russia that we should be thinking about beyond just the defense aspects of our military force?
Well, we have to address each individual situation individually, but we have to address them. For example, it is remarkable. But it's caused by the fact that there were a number of bipartisan Codels that went over to Ukraine to witness what was happening there, that 2 Congresses ago, we voted unanimously. I mean, think of the people in Congress. Think how extraordinary that is. We voted unanimously to authorize more than $300 million of lethal defensive weaponry for Ukraine, for those courageous peoples, because people like John McCain and Senator Murphy were on the Maidan. There are people like myself that were there shortly after and walked up the Maidan and saw the bullet holes of the slaughter. We want to support those courageous individuals. So we actually have to support and honor these international agreements, the Budapest Memorandum that we basically provided. I'm not sure what was the word. Was it a guarantee? Was it a commitment? But whatever the word is, it was a guarantee, a commitment to make sure that they had their territorial integrity, and we would help them defend that in exchange for them giving up nuclear weapons. When we don't do that, what signal do we send? You have to take a look at what happens, the result of action or inaction. Gaddafi was pressured into dismantling his nuclear program. The result for Gaddafi, he was bloodied and dead on the street. What signal does that send to Iran? What signal does that send to North Korea? So action as well as inaction has incredible consequences later on. So we've got to approach each one of these situations with strength and resolve. I wish Russia was no more than a friendly adversary right now, or a friendly rival. Right now they're an adversary. I don't want to turn them into an enemy, but the only way we prevent them from becoming an enemy is by, again, addressing and challenging them step by step. We just can't let them continue on this path of aggression.
Do you, in your conversations to date with the administration, do you have hope for the provision of the lethal assistance to Ukraine? Do you think that's something you see them moving out on quickly?
Well, I think it's still too early to tell. We did have Secretary Tillerson invited the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for lunch over on Thursday, and I'll tell you, I was pretty impressed with just how succinctly he laid out, really the top 4 problems he's dealing with right now, and I'll just tell you the order. Start out with North Korea, which is a vexing problem, has been and will continue to be. Move right into China. Is that related to that? Then he talked about ISIS, and then talked about Russia. I mean, there you go. You got the four big ones that we have to deal with right now. And so he laid out the principles from his standpoint, but I think it's pretty early in this administration to really find out exactly what those policies are. I was comforted by the fact that he was able to lay it so succinctly and state some principles that I pretty well believe in, and it really does start with strength and resolve.
The Russia cyber challenge, meddling in elections, they had, I'm sure you know, many years ago, a very well publicized attack on Estonia, concern about their potential meddling in other elections in Europe, and then overall a digital presence, if you will, that is somewhat ominous, hanging over all of us, I think, in our Gmail accounts. What's your sense of how the United States can best position itself, organize itself to defeat a state-based threat of that magnitude in the cyber realm?
It's interesting, as Chairman of Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee, we have 4 primary priorities on the Homeland Security side. It's border security, it's cybersecurity, it's protecting our critical infrastructure, which has a huge cybersecurity aspect to that, and then countering Islamist terror, which also has a huge cybersecurity aspect to it. So when Secretary Johnson met with me right before he left, his primary point, he said that the thing you've got to worry about, the top priority of the next administration has got to be cybersecurity. So it's just true. If you take a look, just read public reports on what we believe was a Russian cyber attack on Ukraine's electrical grid. Incredibly sophisticated, incredibly dangerous. So, I mean, the threats around cyber are multifaceted. It's cyber crimes, it's industrial espionage, it is potentially cyber warfare, cyber attacks. It's meddling in the elections. It's disinformation. By the way, I've been pretty far ahead of the curve on Russian disinformation. It always surprised me when you go on Codell's with other members and they would just listen to our European partners talk about the pervasiveness of the disinformation. And by the way, that's what they're primarily trying to sow, is just doubt. They realize that they really can't get people to believe a lot of the things they're saying, so what they're trying to do is they're trying to get people to believe that you can't believe anything. They're just trying to sow that disinformation, but that is their primary tool. And one thing we have not done, and we must, it's probably the most cost-effective thing we can do, is counter that propaganda, that kind of disinformation. Now the good news is what you saw in Russia just recently with the youth uprising, or protest, or whatever you want to call it. The youth's not buying it. As long as we keep a relatively free and open internet, as long as people throughout the world have access to information, they're not believing Putin. They're living under his rule. And so we've got to keep that flow of information, but we have to make a concerted effort to counter the disinformation and propaganda.
You've been vocal, this links very much to you've been vocal about the number of political assassinations, attempted assassinations, they're ongoing, seemingly ongoing, from Putin and his cohort. Human rights and Russia, should human rights be central on our agenda with regard to Russia? It's
probably the number one thing that those courageous individuals that are in the resistance are asking us to do, is maintain those types of standards. I mean, the most recent assassination, an ex-Duma official, was gunned down in the streets of Kiev. Right. I meet with these individuals. I met with Boris Nemtsov a number of times. He testified before our committee, and every time you shake his hands, you say Godspeed, and you just hope and pray. Well, we actually had a hearing on these political assassinations. They total at least 30, and the day before, it wasn't planned this way, the day before, Boris Nemtsov was gunned down, probably the most public bridge, the most, there's surveillance cameras all over the place. I mean, just the impunity with which this is occurring is actually quite frightening. And so we need to understand exactly what this regime is. It is interesting. As I've talked to more people, it's not necessarily just Putin ordering these things. It could be his oligarchs that surround him trying to do him a favor. This is out of control, and that's why I think from the West standpoint, if we're going to start, and we've done this, the sanctions, the best sanctions are targeted to those individuals. Deny them access to financial markets in the rest of the world, deny them travel. I think that's probably the best chance we have for really putting the right kind of pressure through sanctions on Russia and their oligarchs.
Do you think there need to be any changes in the U.S. or EU current sanctions approach that we're using with regard to Russia?
It's all complex, and it's hard to target exactly what you should do. But sanctions that create general economic harm maybe aren't the smartest sanctions to be imposing. In here, there's a really good chart about Russian public opinion against America. It's really at all-time lows. That's not a good thing. We want the Russian people understanding that their direction should be Western-leaning. I mean, it is depressing after the fall of the Soviet Union that Russia under Putin didn't really grasp the outstretched hand of the West. Obviously the events in the world would be far better if we had a Russia that was no worse than a friendly rival. But that's just not the case. So we've got to be very careful with the sanctions that we designed, that they don't turn Russian public opinion against us. They need to be designed to turn public opinion against Putin and his henchmen.
Let's talk a little about the investigations with regard to the U.S. election, Russia's role. You, in the past at least, have been willing to let, maybe that's the fairest way to put it, the congressional investigation process move forward. What is your view at this point, given the happenings of the last week, particularly with Representative Nunes's press conferences?
Well, it's unfortunate what's happened with the House Intelligence Committee. I think the Senate Intelligence Committee is still operating in a very bipartisan fashion. And from my standpoint, we are already talking about things in the public domain that we shouldn't be. There's a reason you have classified material. There's a reason that things are kept secret for national security. So I think we need to respect that process. If it doesn't continue bipartisan, if Mark Warner, for example, isn't happy with what the Republicans are doing, we'll hear about it. But let's give the Senate Intel Committee a chance to work diligently, work thoroughly, hopefully work with expeditiously to find out the answers we do, and then we'll take it from there. But I think that is definitely the first step. From my standpoint, the nice thing about Intel Committee is it can operate behind closed doors. Have you ever noticed that some members of Congress preen before the cameras? I don't think that's the best way to get to the heart of this. So let's let responsible members of the United States Senate, let's let them do their work, do it in a bipartisan fashion. Let's read the report, and then let's see what the next step needs to be. But let me just say, we have to get to the bottom of this. We have to understand what the truth is.
You've praised Attorney General Jeff Sessions for recusing himself from any investigation. Are there others you think need to step forward to do the same?
I have no idea at this point in time.
Okay. Great. You chair, as I said at the beginning, the subcommittee on foreign relations on Europe. You've just come from the Brussels Forum. NATO and the EU. Do you think these are institutions that should be built up, tear down and rebuild, if you will, or where do you think the way ahead is for these two primary institutions?
NATO, the EU deserves our strength, or our support, and they need to be strengthened. There's just no doubt about it. One of our messages was, when Senator McCain and I went there, was that we do value this, and I think on a completely bipartisan basis, in the United States Congress, we understand. Just as Secretary Mattis said, if NATO didn't exist, we'd have to create it. So there's no doubt about that. There's also no doubt about the fact that foreign aid is probably the most unpopular spending publicly, in terms of public opinion. And year after year, when the American public hears that our NATO partners aren't even meeting their 2% commitment, that makes it more difficult for the United States Congress to continue to support foreign aid and our support for NATO. So that was a pretty strong message that I tried to convey to our NATO partners, who, by the way, I think they've gotten religion. I think they've certainly verbally made the commitment to move toward that 2%. As important, maybe more important than the 2%, though, is that the money they spend is spent well and wisely in a very coordinated fashion. There are some of our partners that aren't even close to 2%, but boy, do they spend it well. And it is also important for us in America to understand that NATO has only invoked Article 5 of its charter one time, and that was after the attack on America in 9/11. And since that time, our NATO partners have partnered and allied with us, and they have lost their sons and daughters. Their sons and daughters have fought alongside ours, and they've made the ultimate sacrifice as well for peace and security. So yes, the 2% is important, and yes, it'd be helpful for public opinion if they were already at 2%. But I think it's also incumbent on us to point out that our NATO allies have stood by us, and they've made tremendous sacrifices as well. So let's work cooperatively together. Let's keep needling them, because it's important for Russia and other aggressive powers to realize that we're serious. I mean, from my standpoint, that's almost the most important part of meeting that 2% is the signal it sends. The substance is also important. Spending it well is important. But just the signal it sends about, we realize that the end of history has not arrived, that the world is still a dangerous place, and that you only do achieve peace through strength. So I think that meeting that 2% commitment is extremely important.
You just, as I said, came from Brussels. John McCain had been at Munich and at Brussels. What is your sense at this point of how reassured our European allies feel at this point in the Trump administration, given the comments by then President-elect or candidate Trump regarding NATO?
They're very nervous, and it's hard to blame them. So that's obviously where we're going there. That's why I'm making these statements, to provide reassurance. And one of the points I did make is, regardless of the tweets, regardless of some of the comments that do legitimately give you cause for concern, take a look at the extraordinary fact that on a unanimous basis, we voted for lethal defensive weaponry. Now, unfortunately, the last administration didn't take us up on that authorization, but that's still a pretty extraordinary amount of support when members of Congress understand what's at stake. When they take the time and go over to Europe, and they go over to a place like Ukraine, they see the result of that aggression. They see the courage of the people, of the Ukrainians. We will, as a nation, support that. So, again, I think we'll see how this all works out. Certainly from our standpoint, I think it's extremely important that organizations like this, certainly members of the United States Congress, try and provide the reassurance that I think is very genuine and is the true reality.
I'm just going to ask two more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Force posture in Europe. The United States has, since the end of the Cold War, significantly drawn down its force structure. It's altered it, hoping to increase its relevance, if you will, to 21st century threats. We talked at the beginning that the military strength is very important, but maybe not the only tool. What is most important from your point of view to improve in terms of the U.S. military presence or capability set, even if not present in Europe? And then what are the corresponding, if you will, State Department, intelligence community, and development aspects of that posture?
I think more forward deployments in a more robust and regular fashion. I think the air patrols, I think, in the Baltic states, I think is extremely important. So we just have to show that commitment, that presence, and we've got to convey that we're not going to be backing off on that. We're going to protect the Balkans, the Balkans and the Baltic states. We're going to do everything we can to push back on the aggression in Ukraine and not let them continue to creep into Georgia. So we just got to push back at every point that they're pushing us in.
State Department budget?
Let me first say I'm highly sympathetic with what President Trump is trying to signal with what we need to do in terms of fiscal discipline. $20 trillion in debt. We're adding about $500 billion every year. Some of these agencies are completely out of control. I come from a business background. You got downtick in sales. It's not unusual for business managers to go to departments and say, cut your budget 10%, and it happens all the time. I think we could really get some departments focusing on their primary missions, and that'd be a very good thing. That being said, 30% on foreign relations, from my standpoint, I'm a fiscal conservative that has always been very supportive of the most unpopular form of federal government spending, foreign aid, because I truly do think if it's spent well, and that's a big if. There's a lot of places it's not, and that really undermines foreign aid spending. We have to make sure it's spent well, but if it is spent well, it's money well spent. And we should continue to spend it. But again, I think everything should be looked at. We should be kicking the tires. And I'm not happy with what happened at the end of the Obama administration in terms of our abstention on that vote, that anti-Israel vote. And that is something that...
at the UN.
At the UN. That is something that I think we all ought to be taking a look at as well. There's a lot of corruption in the UN, and we've just kind of allowed that corruption to go undisciplined, and I think it's about time to start enforcing some discipline at the UN in terms of spending.
That was actually a follow-up to my prior question, so I do have one more question, which is just on cooperation with Russia. You know, the way to induce someone includes carrots and sticks, typically. Where are there areas you think we could where could we plausibly put forward to Russia that there is a possibility for cooperation that can reduce tensions?
Well, both nations are under threat of Islamist terror. We just are. But I tell you, we got to be a little careful about being too eager to cooperate until we have enough time to shore up our defenses and show strength and resolve. We could be snookered in deals, I think, pretty easily, quite honestly, in our desire to quickly do it. So I think this will take a little bit of time. I think we just have to show our commitment. We got to show the strength and resolve, and then we, where we can cooperate, we'll end up with far more balanced deals in terms of cooperation. But listen, we should always be looking for areas of agreement. It's the way to make sure that they don't slip from an unfriendly adversary into an enemy category. Let's be over time moving toward that friendly rival, if at all possible.
Okay, I am sure we have a lot of questions from the audience. We do have microphones, and when I call on you, please state your name and ask a question that is topical to today's discussion. So who has questions? It's right up here. And please give your affiliation if you have one.
Thank you, Senator. I'm Anthony Garrett from Internews, and my question has to do with cybersecurity, and I was heartened by your comments. Will the Senate and will the Congress fund the kind of money that's needed to really make us secure from a cyber perspective? Thank you.
Cyber purity.
Right. Well, certainly from my standpoint, we should. Top priority of the federal government is defense of the nation, defense of the homeland, and that, again, you see my priorities. It's right. It's a major component in 3 of them. So we need to be a lot smarter. One of the questions I keep asking experts in this field, and I'm not one. I mean, my son's got to load apps on my iPhone for me, so I'm not a computer scientist. But I have a general sense that the attackers, the people on offense, are always going to be ahead of us. And right now, we are a long way behind in terms of defense. Now, the good news is cyber defense isn't the same thing as physical defense. It's not like you've got to build walls. You don't have to build up tanks and armor. Once you come up with really good cyber defenses, you can blanket cyberspace at the speed of light. But that requires a fair amount of cooperation, and there's an awful lot of complexity in that as well. How much of what our federal government knows in terms of classified information should we share with the private sector? It'd be nice if we could share all of it, because that's going to increase our defenses. These known threat signatures, at the same time we do that, it takes away potentially from our offensive capability. So none of these are easy issues, but I think we really ought to engage the world. And actually I just met with the head of the cyber directorate from Israel. And his suggestion was get a limited coalition of the willing. Maybe it would be, well, I don't want to name names, I don't want to name countries, but maybe 2 or 3 countries that can really work on definition of, what is cyber warfare? What is strange? If a bomb would have taken out the computers, in some of these attacks, like at Sony, obviously it would have been warfare, but when we do it with the electronic beams, it seems to be something else. So we really do need to develop policies and conventions about exactly what we're going to define as cyber warfare, what our response should be. But even that is difficult because you can't with 100% certainty all the time know who's the perpetrator. I mean, cyber, or nation states, the sophisticated ones, are pretty good at masking their attacks as well. So this is unbelievably complex, but it's unbelievably important that we address it. I don't think defense will ever catch up with offense, but we really need to make a concerted effort. And that will require funds. One thing we need to do is we have to bust out of the bureaucratic pay limits, and we need to be able to attract to the American government the absolute best and brightest, because in the world today, the best computer scientists, I mean, they can make, an order of magnitude more in the private sector than when we can do. So, thank the ones that are already working there. And we do have some of the best, if not the best. And they're doing it at a real personal sacrifice. So these are patriots. So it's one of the reasons I do find it offensive when people are all outraged, the NSA, or, I meet these people, I talk to these people. These are patriots. They are not interested in reading your email. They're not. They're interested in keeping this nation safe. And I think it's extremely important that we keep all these things in perspective. I mean, every time you say, I agree to the terms on an app, you're providing the cyber world far more information. I mean, multiple orders of magnitude more information on yourself than NSA ever tried to collect in terms of their data collection program. So, I mean, let's be real about this and understand these are patriots trying to keep this nation safe.
Other questions? This one right back here.
Allison Patch, APCO Worldwide. The first recommendation in the report for the strategic objective CSIS is recommending is that we shore up institutions in Europe. So you started to touch on the UN a little bit, but I was wondering, given the fact that TTIP is sort of dead, and in another CSIS report, they've talked a lot about Russia's soft power influence in economic institutions. What do you think is the future of U.S. involvement on the soft power front in Europe and our engagement on the economic and legal front?
Well, I am a unabashed free trader. It's got to be fair. We have to end abuses, and there's plenty of abuses. America's been quite magnanimous. We are the world's largest market. I think we can afford to be magnanimous, but we can't be chumps. And so I think we really do need to target some of the non-tariff abuses, trade barriers that are erected. I think it's going to be necessary just from a standpoint of public opinion so that we can actually engage in the fair trade that is mutually beneficial. Right now, TTIP is off the table, I think largely because there are elections in Europe. It's not particularly popular in Europe. It's a really hard sell, particularly when you have 28 nations that have got to agree to every term. So it's a pretty heavy lift. I'm highly concerned about, on the one hand, my heart was kind of with Brexit because you see the bureaucracy of the EU, and there's a kind of a stroke for freedom. At the same time, my head tells me that's going to be a pretty dangerous time period in terms of the 2-year period. Certainly there's an awful lot of talk in Europe that they've got to negotiate a pretty tough deal with Britain or other people will start leaving. So this is a pretty perilous time right now, and Brexit is going to present a real challenge. I wish we were closer to a real good trade agreement. These multilateral trade agreements are just difficult, and you end up, to a certain extent, negotiating the lowest common denominator. So I've got an open mind in terms of multilateral versus bilateral trade agreements. It's a tough issue, and I'll finish on this note. Free traders are losing the battle. Public opinion has largely turned against free trade, and that's, from my standpoint, a real shame. One of the points I made in Brussels when we were talking about, I was on a panel about work. Somebody asked a question, and my comment was, "You've just made the moral case for free trade." How else are these underdeveloped, less developed countries going to rise up so that their population of people have something to do, that they don't continue to be breeding grounds from terrorists because young men got nothing to do? The way to do that is engage in free trade, and I like to look at, for example, China, because I've exported to China. as a 1.2 billion person potential market rather than as a threat to our economy. So again, I just want to take a look at this from a very realistic standpoint and do everything we can. We should be cheerleading for other countries' economies to grow. It'll be beneficial to us. This isn't a competition that we want to see, only have us grow. No, we want the entire world economy to grow. That's good, and we should cooperate to have that happen.
Okay. Next question right here.
My name is John Tropp. I'm associate editor of the Post-Eagle Weekly newspaper, and my question goes to a topic raised by Director Hicks: Kremlin involvement in political assassinations. Since 2012, 4 independent academic conferences took place in Poland which tested the plausibility of the official Russian Mack and Miller Commission interpretations of what caused the Smolensk disaster of 10 April 2010, in which the President of Poland and 95 others perished at Smolensk North Military Airfield. One of those who perished was a United States citizen. Inasmuch as the official versions have been discredited now, and inasmuch as back in 2011, United States Senator Richard Burr sponsored a United States Senate resolution calling for an independent international investigation of Smolensk, do you think it's time for the Senate to hold hearings on Smolensk, perhaps to ask for a presidential finding to bolster those hearings to give evidence?
We're, as chairman of the European subcommittee, we're discussing right now with I've had 2 ranking members, Senator Murphy. Well, actually, he was the chairman when I was ranking member. Then Senator Sheen was my ranking member last Congress, now Senator Murphy. So we're talking about exactly what type of hearings we should be holding. It's really the value of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is be able to hold hearings, highlight these things, pass resolutions. I mean, sometimes people, that's just a resolution. What good is that? It's a big deal. I remember when we held a hearing on what was happening in Georgia. It was live streamed in Georgia. It's a big deal. So, no, I think that's certainly an instance that needs to be investigated, and certainly a potential for a hearing to highlight that so we can get to the bottom of it. Again, and the whole point is to highlight so the American public, so the world public, quite honestly, sees what is happening and what kind of aggression and what we can do to counter it.
Great. Right here.
Leonard Crook with ICF. Could you comment on American posture vis-a-vis the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement, and climate change?
I'm probably not on the same page with you on that one. I've been accused of being a climate change denier. I'm not. I'm just not an alarmist. I can quote you all kind of stats, but I come from a state that during the last glaciation period, about 20-some thousand years ago, we were covered by a mile-thick glacier. I realized there were men and women back then, but not building enough campfires to produce CO2 to cause that glacier to recede. So there are other forces at play here. I don't think it's settled science in terms of exactly what causation man has in this. Little factoid, over the last 100 years, if you can believe they actually could this accurately calculate temperature 100 years ago, the climate has warmed, consensus about 1.7 degrees. Life expectancy has increased 31 years. Sea levels rose since that last glaciation period about 390 feet in the Bay of San Francisco. So climate has always changed, it always will. I think the question has to be, again, I think we have to continue to monitor it, keep an open mind. I have an open mind. But I think at this point in time, is it really worth spending hundreds of billions of dollars to do what? Can we really have an effect? I mean, there are studies. I know a fellow at the Cato Institute says if you implement everything, you'd affect the temperature according to their models by 0.032 degrees. And yet we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars in this effort. So I'm just not on board. I would refer you to some of the writings of Bjorn Lomborg at the Copenhagen Consensus. Very, very thoughtful group, very thoughtful man, talking about with limited resources in the world, and let's face it, resources are limited. What is the best way and again, the most unpopular spending, foreign aid, spending outside the country. What is the best way to spend those limited resources from all countries for the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people? And his conclusion, although he completely believes in man-made climate change, we're a little bit different on that, but we come to the same conclusion. He says we shouldn't spend a dime on it because those limited resources would be so much better spent in so many other areas, digging wells, combating malaria. So I just don't think, to a certain extent, I think we're spending money that should really be directed to other areas in terms of trying to turn back the tides, which I don't think we are necessarily capable of doing.
Other questions? So I'll go here first.
My name is Irakli Saralidze. I don't have currently any affiliation. I'm representing my country, Georgia. You mentioned about the different tools how to counter and challenge Russia's increasing balance in post-Soviet space. However, I think that Turkey is a very key player. But by challenging the foundation of secularism and the current upcoming referendum, I think is kind of very scary signal, and it can reshape the Turkey's engagement. So how do you see the future of Turkey? Because once again, I think it's very decisive for Georgia, in terms of black regional cooperation for Romania and Bulgaria.
You're talking about Turkey, correct?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
A real pivotal country at this point in time. I think most of us in the West are not happy with the direction of Turkey. We're not happy with their cooperation. But I'd much rather have Turkey be part of NATO than not part of NATO. So we have to continue to engage with them. Right now, I think the most significant issue facing us in terms of our relationship with Turkey is how do we defeat ISIS in Raqqa? Who do we use once defeated? Who's going to hold that territory? Incredibly vexing problem. We were meeting with representatives from Turkey and they say, well, we can do it. So, okay, well, good. When? I think that's maybe the best way to handle Turkey as it relates to the events in Syria is, okay, if you say you can take Raqqa, give us a timeline. My guess is we wouldn't be very satisfied with the timeline. So we want to positively engage with them. I think, again, here's an area where Russia's aggression, they're opening up additional fronts. They're opening up strengthening relationships with Turkey. They are, again, on the cheap, all of a sudden getting in there with weapons deals, different countries. We just opened the door and we just let them walk in. Cost the U.S., cost West an awful lot to keep Russia out of those regions, and we just let them walk right back in, and that's one of the areas, too. Their cooperation with Turkey right now is definitely concerning.
Russia has vastly increased its arms sales, as you alluded to, and the Middle East is a prime marketplace for it. How do you think about the shifting Russian attitude toward the Middle East in terms of whether they're just looking to solidify, if you will, their base in Syria, or are they looking, the Egyptians recently met with the Russians. Where do you think the Russians might be going vis-a-vis beyond Europe?
Well, as a business person, you take a look at really the strategic brilliance of arms sales.
Right.
You get a country to commit to purchase your weapon systems, and you've got kind of a long-term alliance with them. They need you for spare parts and everything else. So, and plus, it positively affects your economy. So we can sit here in the U.S. and take a look at different countries and not be happy with their regimes. I think one thing we have learned, after the fall of Mubarak and Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein is there's a reason some of these countries have kind of strong leaders, kind of keep some of the terrorists at bay. So we can take a look at some of these strong leaders and say we're just not going to offer them weapon systems. Well, when we take that posture, that creates a void. Somebody else like Russia steps in, they'll start supplying the weapon system, the world becomes a more dangerous place. So I don't like the reality occurring in the world. I don't like the reality of some of these situations we face. But you have to accept that reality, and there's an awful lot about real politics that You just can't deny. And so from my standpoint, I'd rather be responsibly providing weapon systems for the defense of some of these nations and continue to deepen our relationship so that in the end, what America can provide is leadership in terms of our principles and our values. I talked earlier about, we can't be the world's policeman, but we should, where we can, stabilize the situation. We stabilize the situation, and the leadership that I think is most valuable about America is our values and our principles of freedom and democracy and free markets. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect world. Not everybody's going to embrace that, but we keep holding those things out. We just keep demonstrating, hopefully by good example. I think that's the best thing we can really do for the world.
Okay, we had a question right here.
Hello, this is Gary O'Donoghue. I'm the Washington correspondent for BBC News. Senator, I wanted to ask you about something James Comey said last week at the House hearing. He said that the Russians had made no attempt to cover their tracks during their cyber attacks. He said it was as if they wanted us to notice what we were doing. I wondered what your take on that was as part of the strategy, and also, given that, and given what you said about combined $34 trillion GDP versus $2 trillion, is the best strategy to send armoured brigades to Poland and fly a few more planes around the Baltics, or is the best strategy to give them a taste of their own medicine?
Well, we are certainly trying to counter it, and we're not as, let's put it this way, Russia's been pretty brilliant in terms of how they've been doing this. I mean, with what assets they have, that far smaller economy, the disinformation, the chaos they're sowing is pretty remarkable. It'd be nice if we were a bit clear-headed about exactly what this was. I mean, anybody here not realize before the election that Russia was probably meddling in it? I mean, it's kind of like the old Casablanca, gambling in Casablanca, I'm shocked, It didn't come as a surprise to me that, Russia just has a new tool, it's called the internet, and they used it. Now, again, we've got to get to the bottom. Was there any, collaboration? Right now, people are saying there's no evidence of that. But no, they've been brilliant in terms of how they've used this. We need to be as brilliant in terms of assessing it, and don't get so spun up out of control out of it either. What should be leading the news headlines isn't, this Russian probe. It should be the assassinations. It should be the fact that somebody's pushed out of, maybe tripped, out of a 4-story building. That Karamurza was poisoned again. That somebody was gunned down in Ukraine. How about 500,000 Syrians slaughtered? So our news media does tend to distract us from the main issue. And from our standpoint, we need both. I mean, we need a military response in terms of a show of strength and bolstering our defenses and more spending and stop hollowing out our military. By the way, our military is being hollowed out. I was one senator working with the Obama White House right after President Obama got reelected, trying to find common ground on this debt and deficit issue. And I remember sitting in the White House with the Chief of Staff, and they were showing us some pretty scary readiness figures. This is in 2013. And it just got worse over that time. So we definitely have to do that, but again, we've got to counter the propaganda, and that's the cheapest thing to do, and we really aren't doing it effectively. We're doing some things, but we don't have Russia Today. We don't have entertainment. Actually, let's put it this way, propaganda masked as entertainment. I mean, it's brilliant what they're doing. It's just completely cynical. It's just all destabilizing. They don't have the resources. We have the resources to stabilize. All they have is the resources to destabilize, and we have to also recognize, why are they doing it? Why are they trying to destabilize those ring of democracies? I call them fledgling democracies on their western border. It's because if those democracies succeed, their citizens are going to see it, and that puts Vladimir Putin's control at risk. That's what this is all about. It's all about his power. It's all about his control. It's a horrible reality, but it is. We have to recognize that reality, and we need to counter it. And so we do need to counter it in a far more robust fashion with our own truth. It's not propaganda. It's truth. And that's why we have to keep an open and free internet. It's one of the reasons you have to be very careful about giving international organizations control over the internet. You know, the U.S. has done a pretty darn good job of managing that process and keeping it open and free. And it's going to be crucial for any freedom-loving person in any country that we have that kind of free flow of truth and information.
Senator Johnson, I think that's a perfect place to end. I want to thank you for taking time out of what is a very busy schedule. I promised you I'd get you going. I can't promise for Washington traffic, but I think you'll make your vote on time. We're going to take a 15-minute break after Senator Johnson leaves the stage, and we will reset for our second panel discussion. But before we do that, please join me in a round of applause to thank Senator Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
The war in Syria represents a new low for the international community. We're seeing a war without law, as well as seemingly a war without end. It's very, very striking that we're living in an age of the bombing of UN convoys, never mind the targeting of hospitals.